Dr. Aris Thorne was already behind schedule. As his electric coupe whispered to a stop in the doctor's parking garage of St. Jude's Metropolitan Hospital, he checked the time on his car's display. 15 minutes before the organ transfer was set to begin. His pulse quickened. This was a procedure where every second counted, a delicate dance against time he had perfected over years of training. Today was the culmination of a month-long effort to secure a donor heart for a 14-year-old patient, a case that had garnered significant media attention and weighed heavily on him. Exiting his car, Aris took a calming breath, his distinguished, silver-streaked hair catching the sterile, fluorescent light. As a celebrated black cardiothoracic surgeon, he was no stranger to navigating institutional hurdles. But the stakes of this particular surgery felt monumental. This wasn't just another procedure for him. It was a promise he had made to a family. The patient, a young girl named Maya, had been unfairly denied placement on the transplant list at another hospital, a decision Aris suspected was rooted in socioeconomic bias. He had fought to get her case transferred here, and this was his chance to make it right. Aris moved swiftly through the garage, his leather-soled shoes making soft, urgent sounds on the concrete. He bypassed the main lobby entrance, heading for the direct access point to the surgical wing, a route he took every day. A crowd of journalists was already gathered at the hospital's main entrance, hoping for an update on the high-profile surgery. He simply didn't have the mental space for their questions right now. As he approached the secure entryway, he saw a new security guard, a young white man, standing by the scanner. The guard's posture was rigid, and his gaze followed Aris with an unnerving intensity. Aris reached for the security badge clipped to his lab coat, a motion he had performed thousands of times. But before he could swipe it, the guard stepped directly into his path. "Sir, I'm going to need to see your credentials," the guard said, his voice clipped and authoritative. Aris paused, slightly annoyed by the delay. "I'm Dr. Thorne," he replied, holding the badge up clearly. "I'm scrubbing in for the heart transplant this morning." The guard barely glanced at the ID. His eyes, cool and appraising, swept over Aris from head to toe. Aris felt a familiar knot of frustration tighten in his gut, but maintained his professional composure. "There's been a security alert, sir, and you fit the profile of an individual we're looking for. I need you to come with me to answer some questions," the guard stated, his tone unwavering. Aris stared at him, the absurdity of the moment washing over him. The irony was almost suffocating. He was here to save a life, to correct an injustice, and he was being blocked at the door by the very kind of baseless suspicion he fought against. "Officer," he said, his voice firm but controlled, even as his heart hammered against his ribs, "I do not have time for this. The patient's new heart is on a strict timeline, and I need to be in that operating room now." He presented his badge again, hoping the guard would see his name, his title, and realize the gravity of his mistake. But the man was resolute. His hand drifted toward the two-way radio on his belt. "I don't care what you say your name is, sir," he said, taking a step closer. "You need to cooperate." Aris's breath caught in his throat as the situation threatened to spiral out of control. He could see it in the guard's eyes, a dangerous combination of suspicion and misplaced righteousness he'd encountered far too many times before. It wasn't about hospital security. It was about the color of his skin. Just as he was about to argue further, a familiar voice cut through the tension. "What's the holdup here?" Elena Ramirez, the head surgical nurse, appeared, her expression a mix of confusion and urgency. Her eyes widened in recognition. "Dr. Thorne?" "Yes, Elena," Aris answered, his voice tight with restrained anger. Elena shot a sharp look at the young guard. "Let him through, now," she ordered, her tone brooking no argument. The guard, whose name tag read Corrigan, took a defensive step back but didn't yield. "He fits the description from the security bulletin," he insisted, his jaw set stubbornly. "That's the chief of cardiothoracic surgery," Elena retorted, her voice rising in disbelief. "Are you trying to get fired on your first week?" Corrigan mumbled something about just following orders. But he finally, reluctantly, stepped aside. Aris took a deep, steadying breath, forcing himself to compartmentalize the rage and focus on the task ahead. He couldn't let this man's prejudice cost a young girl her life. "Are you okay, doctor?" Elena asked, her voice now laced with concern as they walked quickly down the hall. Aris gave a curt nod, though his hands were clenched into fists at his sides. "I'm fine, thank you, Elena." Without another word, he pushed through the doors into the sterile prep area, the clinical smell of antiseptic a welcome comfort. But as he began the methodical process of scrubbing in, the confrontation replayed in his mind. He had faced racism throughout his career, but for it to happen like this, at a moment when a life hung in the balance, felt particularly cruel. The quiet hum of the operating room settled around him as he entered, calling for the team to begin. The surgery started, a complex and beautiful choreography of skill and precision. Yet, Aris's mind kept flashing back to the guard's accusatory stare, the way he had been judged and dismissed in an instant. The incident felt deeply connected to the reason they were all here, fighting for a patient who had been dismissed by another system. Then came the most critical part of the procedure, the placement of the new heart. Aris leaned over Maya's still chest, his focus absolute. Her life was in his hands, a fragile trust he refused to betray. He worked with a fierce concentration, channeling his anger into the meticulous stitches that would give this child a future. He could feel the weight of her family's hopes with every movement. This surgery was more than a medical victory. It was an act of defiance against the biases that sought to devalue lives like hers and his. Halfway through the most delicate phase of the operation, the door to the observation gallery slid open, and Aris's focus momentarily broke. Through the glass, he saw the young guard, Corrigan, standing with the hospital's chief of staff, his face ashen. Aris's eyes met the guard's for a fraction of a second, every muscle in his body tensing. The chief of staff motioned for Corrigan to watch, to see the man he had profiled as a threat, now holding a life in his hands. Mark Corrigan. Aris hadn't even registered his name during the confrontation. He watched as the chief of staff, Dr. Evans, spoke to the guard, his expression stern and unforgiving. Aris had to force himself to look away, to return his focus to the patient, to remain the professional. But it was difficult. This was the same man who had seen him not as a doctor, but as a danger. Corrigan stood frozen in the gallery, clearly shaken. Dr. Evans began to speak to him, his voice inaudible through the glass, but his message clear from his gestures. He pointed to the monitors displaying Maya's vital signs, then to Aris's steady hands. "I was on patrol when I saw Dr. Thorne," Corrigan would later explain at the disciplinary hearing, his voice much smaller than it had been in the garage. He seemed agitated, not like the other doctors. Aris's grip on the surgical instrument tightened imperceptibly. Agitated, The word echoed in his mind. It was a loaded term, a label so often used to justify suspicion against black men. Dr. Evans pressed on in the hearing. What exactly about Dr. Thorne? Thorne's behavior seemed agitated, Mr. Corrigan? Mark fidgeted in his chair. He was moving fast, seemed determined. It just felt out of place. Aris felt the anger flare inside him again. He had reviewed the security footage. He had been walking at a brisk, professional pace. He had simply been a black man in a hurry, in the eyes of a guard conditioned to see a threat. The Chief of Staff's questioning continued. Did you find anything on Dr. Thorne's person that suggested he was not who he said he was? Mark hesitated, his face turning red. No, he conceded. I didn't. The hearing room was silent for a moment. Aris could feel the weight of the situation, thick and heavy. He glanced at the other board members, watching their expressions. The truth was stark and undeniable. A life had been endangered for no reason other than the color of a man's skin. Corrigan's testimony continued, his weak justifications collapsing with each question Dr. Evans posed. Minor inconsistencies in his report became glaring contradictions under scrutiny. Aris watched him, observing how Corrigan's eyes darted toward him, filled with a dawning, horrified realization. He knew who Aris was now, and he was beginning to understand the catastrophic potential of his actions. When Dr. Evans concluded his questioning, Mark looked like a hollowed-out version of the man who had blocked the surgical wing entrance. Aris felt no satisfaction, only a profound sense of exhaustion. This wasn't about one guard's ignorance. It was about an entire culture that allowed people like Mark to be placed in positions of power with their biases fully intact. As the hearing proceeded, Aris struggled to maintain his composure. He had to remain objective to ensure due process was followed, but it was a monumental effort. The chilling parallels between his own experience and the institutional bias that had nearly cost Maya her place on the transplant list were impossible to dismiss. By the end of the day, the boardroom was thick with tension. The hospital's legal counsel made closing remarks, attempting to frame Mark as an overzealous but well-intentioned employee who had made a regrettable error. But Aris knew the truth, and so did Dr. Evans. Dr. Evans, a formidable woman with a reputation for integrity, rose for her final statement to the board. She turned to her colleagues, her voice powerful and clear. This hearing is not just about Mark Corrigan, she stated. It's about a pattern of institutional failure. It's about a culture where a new guard feels empowered to question our chief of cardiothoracic surgery, based on nothing more than a feeling. It's about how these feelings lead to delays, to risks, and to a fundamental breach of the trust our community places in us. It is time we demand better. The boardroom was still as her words resonated. Aris felt a palpable shift in the room. The board was listening. They were finally understanding. When the hearing concluded, the board went into deliberation, but Aris remained in his seat for a moment longer. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts. He had done his duty, had participated in the process fairly, but the encounter in the garage still haunted him. It was a stark reminder that no amount of achievement or status could make him immune to the lens of racial prejudice. Suddenly, the door to the boardroom opened, and Elena Ramirez, the head nurse who had intervened, entered. She approached him quietly, her face etched with concern. "Dr. Thorne," she began softly, "may I have a word?" Aris looked up, surprised by her presence. "Of course, Elena." Elena sighed, making sure the door was closed. "I wanted to talk about what happened with Corrigan. He's not a monster, you know, but he's young, and he's been trained with a certain mindset." Aris met her gaze, his own expression unreadable. "A mindset," he repeated, his voice laced with a bitter irony. "You mean prejudice?" Elena flinched, but didn't disagree. "Yes, probably. But I need you to know, some of us are trying to change it. From within the system." Aris observed her for a long moment. He wanted to trust her, to believe that meaningful change from within was achievable. But a lifetime of experience had taught him to be cautious with his hope. "What would you have me do," he asked, his voice low, "when I stand in that OR, holding a life in my hands, knowing that my own right to be there was just questioned?" Elena was quiet for a long time before she finally responded. "You keep doing what you do best, Doctor. You keep saving lives and holding this institution to a higher standard. That's the only way anything will ever truly change." Aris nodded slowly, the immense weight of that responsibility settling on his shoulders. The hearing was over, but he knew there would be more fights, more challenges. But for today, a step had been taken. As Elena left the room, Aris looked around the empty boardroom. He knew the struggle was far from finished. But today, accountability had been served. And that, he reasoned, was a beginning. The following morning, a palpable sense of change was in the air at St. Jude's. The hospital board had been in session late into the night, and their decision was expected today. Dr. Aris Thorne sat in his office, attempting to focus on patient charts, but his thoughts were consumed by the potential outcomes of the hearing. This was a critical moment, not just for one guard, but for the entire hospital staff who were watching. This hearing had become about more than one man's bias. It was about the very soul of the institution and the values it claimed to uphold. Aris took a sip of his coffee, gazing at the cityscape through his window. Outside his office, he could hear the hushed but busy rhythm of the hospital. This was more than just his workplace. It was a community he had dedicated his life to. News of the incident had spread, and the story had become a flashpoint for conversations about diversity and inclusion within the medical field. His mind returned to the event. This moment symbolized a larger struggle, the need to reform institutions that allowed implicit bias to fester and influence critical decisions. A soft knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. "Come in," Aris called, his voice steadier than he felt. His administrative assistant, Sarah, entered with a tablet. "The board is ready, Doctor," she said gently. Aris nodded and rose from his chair. He took a deep breath, straightening his white coat. "Let's finish this." As he walked toward the boardroom, his footsteps were the only sound in the quiet administrative hallway. The hospital felt different today, charged with an unspoken anticipation that radiated from every corner. Inside the boardroom, the atmosphere was solemn. The board members sat at the long table, their faces serious. The hospital's legal team, Dr. Evans and Mark Corrigan, were already present, all waiting in tense silence. Aris took his seat, giving a brief, professional nod to Dr. Evans before his gaze settled on Corrigan. The young man looked even smaller today, his eyes fixed on the table in front of him. A man who finally understood he could not escape the repercussions of his choices. The chairman of the board cleared his throat. "Please call the hearing to order," he said, his voice resonating in the still room. The board secretary began to read the official findings. Aris listened intently as they detailed the breach of protocol. the failure in judgment, and the unacceptable risk posed to a patient. The foreman of the board, a stoic woman with graying hair, held a single sheet of paper, her grip tight. The chairman nodded in her direction. Has the board reached a decision regarding the employment of Mr. Corrigan and proposed institutional actions? The foreman stood, her hands trembling almost imperceptibly as she prepared to read. "We have, Mr. Chairman," she affirmed, her voice steady despite the gravity of the moment. "Please read the board's decision," the chairman instructed, his own expression unreadable, though Aris could sense the tension in the room. The foreman looked down at the paper before addressing the room, her voice gaining strength. "In the matter of Security Officer Mark Corrigan, the board has voted for termination of employment, effective immediately." A quiet gasp rippled through the room. Aris glanced at Maya's parents, who sat in the back, their faces a mixture of relief and sorrow. He then looked at Mark Corrigan. The young man was staring forward, his face pale, his hands clenched in his lap. The weight of the decision had clearly landed on him, and for a moment, it seemed he might crumble under it. The chairman rapped his gavel lightly. "This hearing is adjourned." But as people began to gather their belongings, Corrigan suddenly pushed his chair back and stood. "Mr. Chairman," he said, his voice unsteady. Aris paused, looking at him. The room fell silent again, every person turning to face the now former security guard. He was shaking, his face contorted with an emotion Aris couldn't immediately place. I have to say something." He swallowed, his eyes finding Dr. Thorne across the room. "I believed I was doing my job. I thought I was protecting this hospital, but I was wrong." His voice cracked, thick with a shame that seemed to consume him. "I see now. I let what I thought I knew, my own stupid prejudices, get in the way of common sense. And I am so sorry." The silence that followed was profound. Aris felt his own breath catch. It was a raw apology, but it couldn't erase the danger he had created. He thought of all the times his expertise had been questioned, his presence challenged, and knew this apology, however sincere, was only the beginning of a much longer journey for the man who offered it. He met Corrigan's gaze, his voice calm but firm. "Your apology is acknowledged, Mr. Corrigan, but the harm caused by actions like yours goes far beyond one delayed surgery. It erodes trust, it endangers lives, and it perpetuates a system that tells people they don't belong. An apology does not repair that." Mark nodded, his expression one of utter defeat. He didn't offer excuses or try to defend himself. He just stood there, absorbing the consequences. And for the first time, Aris saw not just regret, but the faint glimmer of actual understanding in his eyes. The boardroom slowly cleared out, and Aris remained in his seat for a moment, watching as Maya's parents were comforted by Dr. Evans. Mark Corrigan was escorted quietly from the room, the weight of his future heavy on his young shoulders. Aris's mind was a maelstrom. He had fulfilled his duty to the board and participated in a just process, but it felt incomplete. This hearing was one small victory in a vast, ongoing war against systemic bias. For every Mark Corrigan held accountable, countless others continued to act on their prejudices without consequence. Suddenly, the door opened again, and Elena Ramirez walked in. Aris looked up, and she approached him with a look of profound respect. "Dr. Thorne," she began, May I speak with you? Aris gestured to the chair beside him. Of course. Elena sat, her hands folded in her lap. I just wanted to say thank you. Aris raised an eyebrow. For what, Elena? For seeing this through, she replied. For forcing this hospital to look at itself in the mirror. We need that. This entire system needs that. Aris exhaled slowly, leaning back in his chair. I appreciate you saying that, Elena. But it hardly feels like enough. This was just one incident. There are so many others, so many people who never get this kind of justice. Elena nodded, her expression somber. You're right. But it's not going to be fixed in a day. Every time we stand up, every time we demand accountability, we're laying another brick in a better foundation. Aris was quiet for a long moment, considering her words. He wanted so badly to believe her, to believe that real, lasting change was possible. But decades of experience had made him a pragmatist. What about the next Corrigan? He asked quietly. The ones who've been trained to see the world a certain way? Elena sighed. Honestly, I don't know. There will always be more. But there are also more of us, people like you and me, who are willing to fight it. And I'll keep fighting as long as I'm here. Aris looked at her, and in her tired eyes he saw the same relentless determination that fueled him. You keep doing what you're doing, Doctor, Elena said, standing. That's how we fix this. One patient, one confrontation at a time. Aris nodded slowly. One at a time, he repeated to himself. As Elena left, Aris sat back, staring at the empty boardroom. The fight was not over. It would likely never be completely over. But today, they had made progress. And that, he thought, is how change happens. As the boardroom emptied and the weight of the day's decisions settled, Dr. Aris Thorne remained in his chair. His mind was still processing the events, but there was no sense of triumph, only a sober acknowledgement of a battle won in a much larger war. For Aris, the pursuit of justice and equity extended far beyond this single hearing. It was in every consult, every surgery, and every interaction within the walls of an institution he was determined to improve. He stood, collecting his notes, when a soft voice called his name. It was Maya's mother, approaching him with her husband. Her eyes filled with tears of gratitude. Her face was a portrait of relief, though the stress of the past few weeks was still visible. Dr. Thorne, she said, her voice thick with emotion, we just wanted to thank you for everything you've done. Aris looked at her, his professional demeanor softening. You have nothing to thank me for. I was simply doing my job. Maya's father shook his head. No, it was much more than that. This whole ordeal, it wasn't just about Maya's heart. It was about showing that people like us matter, that our daughter's life has value. You fought for her. Aris felt a familiar tightening in his chest. He understood her meaning completely. I hope this marks a turning point, he said, choosing his words with care. But this is just one hospital. We have so much more work to do. Maya's mother reached out and squeezed his arm. I know, but it's a beginning, and for that, our family will be forever grateful. Aris watched them walk away, and he was struck by the immense responsibility he carried, not just as a surgeon, but as a symbol. One hearing, one terminated employee wasn't enough to correct a culture built on centuries of ingrained bias. But he knew they were right. It was a beginning. He sighed and headed for the exit, his footsteps echoing in the now empty corridor. The media had likely camped out at the main entrance, so he took a back route, hoping to avoid the inevitable questions. As he pushed open the heavy door to the staff parking garage, Aris nearly collided with Mark Corrigan. He was leaning against a concrete pillar, his shoulders slumped, his face pale and drawn. The security uniform was gone, replaced by simple street clothes that made him look younger, more vulnerable. Aris froze, his body tensing. For a long moment, an uncomfortable silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken accusations and regrets. "Dr. Thorne," Mark started, his voice barely a whisper. He pushed himself off the pillar, his eyes meeting Aris's. I didn't think I'd see you again." Aris remained silent, his expression unreadable, waiting for whatever was to come next. He didn't know what the young man could possibly say to bridge the chasm between them, but he stood his ground. "I've just been standing here," Mark continued, his words tumbling out in a rush, "thinking about what happened, about the hearing, and about what I almost cost that little girl." He paused, his hands shoved deep in his pockets. "I know it doesn't mean anything now. I know sorry is just a word. But I need you to understand, I never intended for any of that to happen." Aris's gaze sharpened. He had heard this sentiment before, in different contexts, from different people, but the core was always the same. "You didn't intend for it to happen," he repeated, his voice dangerously low. "But it did, Mr. Corrigan, and it happens every day, to people who look like me. So you'll have to forgive me if your intentions don't offer me much comfort." Mark flinched as if struck, but he didn't look away. "I know. I messed up. I let my training, my biases, whatever you want to call it, take over. I'm trying to figure that out now. But it's not like there's a switch I can just flip. I was taught to see threats, and I didn't even realize what I was doing until today." Aris crossed his arms, his expression still severe. "And what changed? The fact that you lost your job, or the fact that you were finally forced to confront the consequences of your worldview?"